for anyone that's just sort of tuning in to myself or Michael, we did a podcast episode about 3 years ago. It's called Dragon Mother. It was basically a review of Michael's book, and it was actually one of the most popular episodes that I've done. And for people just sort of getting to, an insight into this now, an entry level into this now, Michael's work is about talking about how the child is the child's experience in the womb and the relationship the child has with the mother dictates his whole life and his whole behavior. Whereas Freud mentioned it, in the Oedipal stage, right, which is about 2 to 7 years old. You bring it even further back, and you base this on Otto Rank's findings that sort of
that's right
got him a little bit ostracized, didn't it, from Freud, and he had to kind of go solo a little bit with that work. But this is such an important subject matter because there's not enough material here about what actually goes on in the womb. And you talk about some kind of encirclement around the child. That's the first part where it's the sectioning off from the universal ocean that it lies within. And that can be a good thing and a bad thing. And that it's almost like a semi-permeable membrane where the mother can allow in certain toxins and anxieties and ancestral trauma as well, which you talk about as an atavistic kind of an ancestral archive of trauma from all womanhood, right, that can come in through that semi-permeable membrane. And it's up to the mother to be able to be the gatekeeper of that information and let in certain things and keep other stuff out. But how would you say that the mother is able to do that? Because you mentioned it's partly telepathic, some of this stuff. It's almost unknown to her, it's unconscious to her, right? So how does she consciously will that? How does she use that? Does she actually speak to the child, with the, intending with the child, with the power of sort of consciousness? Or how does she do that? And what would a good mother look like as opposed to a bad mother in that kind of context, Michael?
Yeah, that was a good synopsis as well. You've nailed it, because that's quite a hard thing to summarize. Yeah, the encircling Ouroboros has this responsibility. It is a deep one if she wants her child to grow up masculine and alpha. But the difficulties are not just in her. It's sort of an inbuilt difficulty because of all the animals, we have the longest gestation period. We're not just born in a matter of days or weeks. It's months. It's 9 months. And then think, of the first year, the second year, these fetal and natal periods are very extended. And so she has a lot of work to do in that sense because in the semiotic, let's just say, or, the fetal, like you said, Otto Rank, Stanislav Grof, there's one or two other guys took it back. Even Julia Kristeva, the feminist, started to acknowledge this and did a deep dive herself, acknowledging Rank's theory that it all happens earlier. So feminists have signed on for this. And in the semiotic phase, although it's only a matter of 1 year, 9 months or 2 years, no. In the life of an infant child, of a mind, it's centuries. It's mythological. You're not even in time. You're not even in temporality at all. You're in the mythic time zone. And hundreds of years of experience can elapse while you're in the womb and while you're in the semiotic. And the semiotic is just that pre-symbolic, pre-alphabet world in which lots of communication is taking place. So the woman will be able to take care of it once they acknowledge that they have that role, that in their own structure, genetic structure or phylogenetic structure, there is the ability to work with the child's psyche on that level. Now, if you don't understand that, or nobody's ever told you, like the grandmother, there's no grandmother tradition, your own relationship with your mother is horrific, right? And you yourself are just a fucking, you can breed, but that's about it. Then it's not going to happen. And that child is in peril now. And as it grows through the rest of the Oedipal system, if it doesn't have a wise elder or what's called an enlightened witness, I know people that had that and therefore they were a little bit saved from the horror, or maybe they were fostered or something. It can still happen okay. But generally speaking, unless the mother has herself educated, tuned in, and awakens something atavistic within her that knows that this is a power that she actually has, and then might expose the child, to that kind of, her own auto log is where it all begins and ends. Her motives for having a child in the first place will matter a great deal. and just the embodiment of the real feminine, which is love and care, obviously. But if she doesn't really love and care for herself, and if she's using that child as a crutch or a toy to kill time, because the reality principle, you know, and women are now having children younger and younger and younger, and for worse reasons. The government now makes it fantastic for you to, you know, breed and never have to work again. So we're in a critical position. I wouldn't say that most of those women know what they're doing when they're having a child, except going through the biological aspect. Well, that's animalistic. Surely you can do better than that. And they keep on, you know, my God, the amount of guff about their own entitlement and superior. Why don't you fucking earn it? Show some education, show some interest, not bias, not prejudice. So this message is very, very important. And I would say that it used to be taken care of more in the old, you know, grandmother tradition. There's negatives of that as well. But at the same time, the way sort of, well, what you would have with the midwives and just the grandmother tradition, the nanny tradition, was get out of the way. You don't even know what you're doing here. Let the experts take over. So within womankind, there was, you know, a certain bar set. But that has long collapsed, you know, with the rise of feminism.
Mm. And it's also the passing the child to the father at a certain age, around the age of 7, isn't it? Because then it's sort of the passing the baton in a healthy way so that the child goes into the solar masculine world.
Right.
And I think during that period, up until 7 years old, the father's away at work, and normally the mother vents her frustrations at the masculine, at the male. And then he obviously takes it on as well as a secondary sort of hatred, resentment towards the father and the masculine world. And that taints his view, that taints his lens through which he looks at the world. And that is also another part of, that's another way that she is the terrible mother. And that's what the way that you describe it, isn't it? That's the part of being the terrible mother, is not allowing that easy access into the solar world, into the masculine world, where the child is meant to, you know, Robert Blythe, you know, take from underneath the pillow, you know, the ring from under the pillow, whatever it is, you know. That's the moment where the child then individuates and becomes you know, his own autonomous being. But that's what you would call well, is this what we'd call the devouring mother at this point? Is there kind of a delineation between devouring mother and terrible mother, or do you use those quite interchangeably? Yeah,
just different language for the same thing. But again, a good synopsis you just made there, because that's exactly it. Either she tries to prevent, completely prevent, and we'll explain how that's done in a minute, preventing her infant child from entering the solar, or you enter it. You know, she might want the perks of that. She might, on some level, subliminally be attracted to it. A lot of women are. So they'll let their daughter or their son enter into it, but with a stain of heavy-duty hatred toward it. Now, so when you add those 7 years you just added, now you can see the danger of the length of time. I was just keeping it to the 1.5 or 2 years of, you know, and saying that was hundreds of years in experience. Once you've added the 6 or 7 more years up to what's called the latency period, where the superego is developed and the male world becomes interesting. I mean, it can be interesting at a younger age for people, or a little bit later, whatever, but that's the classic age. You're dealing with a gynocracy, right? A power. The child has been completely shaped by gynocracy. Up until the time that it even gets to understand what, you know, and Freud called that the penis envy period, very misunderstood term. All it really means is when the female discovers that there is such a thing as the male, and that the male has power of its own and a world of its own other than the mother, who's at that point, her power, especially if it was a terrible mother, a devouring mother, her power is then seen as something alien, foreign, Stygian, and basically abusive. And that the male world then, as you rightly indicated, would be seen as a kind of a necessary haven provided by sort of nature almost. It's not that this is ever thought out consciously by men and women, but this is the dynamic that nature has put in place. Now, the masculinized woman, who's not a terrible mother, who's a dragon mother, no problem. She's part of the solar world from the off, and so the child is nicely integrated even at a much earlier age. But the Stygian mother, who is the terrible mother, who wants to maintain a power structure and a control over her weakling, vulnerable, dependent child, this is where the big problems begin. And yeah, this kind of needs to be underlined. You know, when you're looking at this whole Freudian, Rankian, Melanie Klein, any of the early sort of pediatric psychology, this has to be underlined. And to me, it wasn't. Well, you know, it is in somebody like, say, Alice Miller or Melanie Klein. but generally speaking, it's been thrown by the wayside.
And I was going to ask as well, I mean, is it possible that a dragon mother, which is what we're talking about, is a healthy, that's the healthy mother here, can she actually masculinize the child in the womb? Is that something that's possible?
Yeah.
And if so, what is that? What does that look like?
Well, it's hard to say what it would look like because remember, it's different for girls and boys. The basic thing is that she's the ultimate caregiver. But if she's been already in hospital getting poisoned with all the gases and poisons that she puts in, that can affect a child. If she's drugged up the gazoo and have hundreds of injections, so there's a physiological aspect to this as well. And then, as we know, the birth in a hospital is very traumatic. That's not a caring thing to do. So right away, I would say that there's got to be a lot of work for the mother to spend a lot of her time in darkness, in quiet, in water, have a natural birth as easy as possible. Think back to the, not ancient times. Native American Indian women were doing this in historical time. So trying to cultivate some of that so there's no fluorescent lights and, fluoride or whatever, the horrors of the vaccinations and all of this. So there's a lot of physiological stuff that can be done. But even with all of that being done right, still doesn't mean that your kid grows up normally. It's all about the woman's autolog, the mother's autolog. And where this becomes difficult, rather than speak of how it can be made good, I can mostly address how it can go how it can go pear-shaped. And that is because what is that woman's relationship with her own mother? And so the reason why she's even having a child herself can be largely, if not entirely, based in some dynamic that she has with her own mother. So if that mother, right, was a dragon mother or a terrible mother, is going to affect the birth of the new child. It's generational. So there's that to bear in mind as well. But then obviously a lot of it is just common sense. Have a quiet, non-noisy environment, for the child, etc., and play music, classical music. Don't be continuing your own noisy extrovert lifestyle the moment that you conceive. And this includes smoking, drinking, eating bad food, and rushing out to the mall and exposing that little fetus to all the racket and noise of freeways and malls and all the rest of it. So, I mean, all of this stuff is sort of common sense. And once upon a time was common sense. I would say that needs to come back. And you don't see it now. Remember back in the 60s, 70s, you used to have a thing called a pram, a proper perambulator, in which the child was placed flat and his face up. That was all changed to the stroller, in which the child is exposed entirely face on to the oncoming chaos of the world. More Good tears, point. More mama, what's going on? And also all this wrong. When the child is laid flat, the neck and the back of the spine and the stress on the whole spine, not alone that, but the head is very heavy for a child. It needs to be on a pillow lying flat. Well, what the fuck changed there? All the doctors were into that and everything was fine. And not only that, but the perambulator had this hood that could come over that protected the child, not just from the elements and rain, but from the gawks of other people and, their sneezes and coughs and just the whole extrovert nightmare of it. Well, when that was changed to the stroller, and there's a whole story about how that came about, but the women went and bought it because they wanted to show off their kid. So they're using the stroller to crash through doors of bookstores, and there's all this electromagnetism. You crash into Macy's and all the scent and perfume and people, and then the kids are screaming because the changing in the temperature, for instance, right? The noise of all the traffic. There's not even the ounce of protectiveness. So these idiotic things that women have done. What, don't you see that you need to be told that this is toxic? Well, I guess they freaking well do, yeah. And so just a small thing like that. And then there's been many other controversies about baby food, and the thing is elaborate. And it's woman would be masculine to take charge of it. The first signs of a masculinity in a woman, in a mother, would be say, I know what motherhood's all about. And a lot of it's instinctual. I don't have to read it in the book. And I'm taking charge. No, doctor, you're not going to do these ultrasounds. No, doctor, you're not going to do, I'm not going to be jabbed full of these other things. And we're going to make the birth as natural as possible. Now, according to people like Stanislav Grof, don't want to go on about this, but there's a very important dynamic in the child, and I think even Arthur Yanov speaks extensively about this, about the manner in which the child passes through the birth canal. And this is going to decide on the characteristics and personality type of a child, whether it has to fight its way through the canal, or it's sluggish. Well, if it's sluggish, usually it will fight its way through. Or there's another dynamic in which the child has been so drugged inside the womb, or so, for some reason, doesn't push its way through. Then they maybe in an extreme case even have to have a cesarean because the child isn't moving through naturally. Well, they make that a very, very important dynamic in the later temperament of a child. You see, whether they're going to be aggressive and masculine, or they're going to be very, very docile and wimpy and all. So there's a lot of this other study that one can look into. I mean, I recommend, I think it's called The Biology of Love, Arthur Yanov's books. But again, if people pick up Dragon Mother, they'll see the list of books recommended in there. And then who is this thing that you're married to? If it's a brutish man, because this has been your wonderful choice, well, we have that as a problem as well. So the child isn't even going to move into the solar world at all. And even if it does, it's going to find a solar world that's actually quite crude and brutish and unloving and uncaring. That's not good either. But again, doesn't that all devolve to the mother's choices, who she decided to have a child with? I mean, for goodness sake.
Yeah, it's a domino effect, isn't it, from one to the other? And it has to come a point where the woman in that instant, she realizes that the buck stops with her, and she has to be the one that actually breaks the pattern at that point. And as you were saying so well there, it's also leading itself on to raising your kid in a way that isn't stifling, and it's allowing the child to express himself, be assertive. That's part of what I think you called being the, allowing the child to develop into the alpha, to individuate even at that age, from the mother's, so he's not holding on to the mother's apron strings or her. And the devouring mother, the terrible mother, wants to create that codependency where they can't break away. And that's, as you would say, is that to replay the dragon fight that she had with her mother. And it's almost like it's a power trip to get back. It's like bullies do. They push other people down to elevate themselves. In some way, she's taking on that, the terrible mother, in order to somehow banish the fight that she went through with her own mother. Is that right? And she's unconscious of this at that stage.
Yep, that's basically the entire dynamic in one. The replaying, for various reasons. One, it was a power dynamic in which the daughter her will was actually totally crushed. And it was so chaotic, because that's what the terrible mother wants. She wants a chaotic life where the rug is constantly being pulled, when the plans and promises are always being thwarted and changed and rearranged. And so there's a chaos factor in the life of Matrophobia in that dragon fight. And that's one of the reasons why a girl like that, a daughter, will then go on to quickly have her own child, is to try and relive it. It's like a kind of a forensic making sense of. Doesn't work, right? It's not going to happen. But the girl, this is one of the only ways that she can think about doing it, by putting herself in the mother position to say, I'm not going to be like her, right? And maybe sometimes they're not like her, but nevertheless, this is not the way to do it. You don't do it by reliving and setting this domino effect at all. That's not going to work, because you're violating the soul that's coming in. That soul does not need you to work out some psychological hang-ups through it. That's not what the child is be born for. You're already wrong from the start. Try to work it out independently through therapy, or dealing with the mother directly. You are evil. Downloading these thoughts and having the guts to call a mother evil. I mean, it's just as simple as that. We think we do. We might use the words, "Oh, she was a right bitch," Yeah, but has that really sunk in? Can you really make a moral statement that this person was totally responsible for the way that, she treated you, and that she abused power, she abused sexuality, she abused beauty? Yeah, I don't know. I think people hold back. I think they go up so far, and then they don't pass the final judgments. Like the hammer doesn't drop, and so court is always adjourned. And then an easy way out is to have children yourself and relive it. But one thing we forgot to mention about the past two questions is this, and it's Wilhelm Reich's take on it, which is that one of the big no-nos is the touch of a mother to a child, just the physical touch. So autolog is important, her past and all of that, but in the most practical of all terms, not just nice music and darkness and quiet is necessary, but the first touch, and the successive touch on the child's skin and body and musculature, and particularly on the erogenous zones, is going to decide the character. So you can add in what Yanov is saying about the birth canal. I think that it has a lot of importance in character development. But even if that went wrong for some reason, anyway, that's not the end of the world. The touch is the most important aspect that can even erase other bad things that may have happened. So say, for instance, that say a child was abandoned, right, on the steps of a church or a police station or something, and ended up being fostered or adopted by another family. It wouldn't matter how bad what happened, what this first mother was thinking, or she may have even had reasons. That's not important. But the child is brought up by a surrogate mother. Still can work out fine if that surrogate mother takes over and has a positive auto log and also has a positive touch. So it'll be corrected and the child will not grow up so badly. But in any case, single mother or other mothers, surrogate mothers, the touch is the most important because it will affect what's known as body armoring. And body armoring then is a character trait which affects the sexuality big time and pretty much all the personality. You can, even what we know as liberal and conservative. Reichians have spoken elaborately on that very duad there is based in body armoring. But what it really boils down to is sexuality. Look at the sexual mess now with the gender, dysphorias and all. It's all related to this. So what we're talking about is not highfalutin. It's actually presencing now in our world. And it comes about because if the mother is tentative, say like a Puritan mother or a Christian mother who's got these mad ideas about sexuality, femininity in the world, or just another sort of oblivious mother, isn't stimulating the erogenous zones of a child, tickling, caressing, if those are not awakened, then they become sources of unpleasure. Sounds bloody simple, right? And yet the whole human race hasn't got this yet. And so that child now, the very natural centers of pleasure literally flip over and become centers of unpleasure. So you get your Jeffrey Dahmers, and everything in between. Because that person now has a completely, Reich says, distorted view of the world and of pleasure, of mother, of femininity. Because on a subconscious level, the child kind of relies on the mother to awaken those zones. It relies, that's what mother is. Mother is meant to, develop your mind to move towards pleasure and away from pain. It's what a mind is meant to do. It's what a heart is really meant to do, is to guide you from one to the other. And the mother is the one who kicks off this process by saying that it's all right. For your body, physically, it's not really sexually, it's pansexual at that moment, at that time, to have pleasure. But the trick is that if you don't, the consequences are overwhelming because the very centers of pleasure become centers of and they become armored, and they become centers of unpleasure. And this is why then all sorts of other pathologies, including criminal sexual pathology, sadomasochism, you name it, comes about because, this is its foundation. So the very touch of the child's skin, the massaging, the caressing, and mostly important, the stimulating naturally, unpathologically, the centers of pleasure in the child, is absolutely vital for healthy ego development.
Yeah, the children will develop I guess, coping mechanisms to the pain that's not being stimulated to feel that pleasure. So they will direct that into whatever it is. It might even be like needing the blanket or the dummies or whatever it is, but that then goes into the adult form, which is cigarettes, alcohol, criminality, graffitiing, whatever it is. That's a pleasure, but not in the right way. That's not somatic pleasure. That's a one to soothe and pacify the pain that they're feeling in the body in that moment, because it was never addressed in the first place, right?
It's compensatory at that point. Over interest in girl sex, the boys and girls at too young an age will start showing an interest because it's compensatory now. Porn, rough sex, sadomasochism, all of that comes about because of the lack of stimulation early. Now it needs to be exaggerated. All stimuli must be exaggerated. So, when the lads are in school, they're always doing graffiti and it's always vulgar and all of this. They're in trouble. Those kids are the ones who are going to grow up, pretty mean and pretty aggressive in terms of sexuality. And that might swing him over to a more of a chivalric male. You know, there's a lot of problems here. Look at the church. The church is just filled, and this is, I'm talking about even in antiquity, filled with your chivalric male types who, on some level, realizing that something happened to them, they project a physical god. You know, it's like the solar model, but then exaggerated to the supernatural, and they worship that. But the feminine the dark feminine creeps there in there anyway, so it's pretty much a fail. But yeah, so there's a lot of later syndromes as the superego tries to clear up the mess. It creates even more obscenities later on. But Reich is the man to read on that, because he's Children of the Future, his great books to show you exactly, step by step, walks you through how a child will develop in a pathological way and become a problem child even to the parent. The parent will inherit its own neglect through a monstrous child who's already warped, who's already growing up to, abuse animals, and their criminality and delinquency continues until you get what you get now. You know, I mean, look at these Japanese kids who never even leave their room, and obsessed with dolls and obsessed with anime and all the rest of it. Absolutely broken down souls who have no physical contact with nature at all because their mothers didn't touch them lovingly, caringly, and so there's no relationship with the body at all. It's all mind, it's all optics, it's all totally deranged.
They're almost simians, aren't they, in their behavior, in a way? They're so detached from touch and social relationships and stuff like that. I want to bring it back to the term gynocracy, because I think this is an interesting one. It's what the whole thing's about here. Are we saying then that the relationship that the terrible mother has with her children, when you extrapolate that and extend that across society, that is what you would refer to as a gynocracy? It's a sort of an underlying, like a meta-narrative that affects society, right? Extending outwards from the dynamic between terrible mother and child. Is that kind of what we're saying?
Yes, but all of that, see, that's all like domestic social issues that the Arthur Yanovs and the Wilhelm Reiches are focusing on. But when I talk about the gynocracy, I'm actually thinking more along the lines of what Otto Rank and say even Velikovsky talked about, which is pulling back slightly from the canvas to understand woman in a slightly broader context, in terms of atavism, in terms of trying to link all the different facets of what they're doing today, especially these entitled radical ones, the feminists, in other words. What's the roots of all of that? Because remember, original feminism wasn't anything like as man-hating as the one that we've got today. It was about social reform. Well, what the hell? What's wrong with that? We fucking needed it. Kids walking barefoot to school in 1960s, 1930s and 40s England, in bare feet in the freezing cold. Yeah, I think we need some reform and all the rest of it. So that's fine. But how did it morph suddenly into what it is now is a fascinating subject that most people haven't studied. And but then once you get into that study, you have to get into then atavistic programming. And the media ties into this because it works on women's psyche to awaken atavistic memory, which is very anti-male, anti-masculine. And so that is what I see as the gynocracy, is women who are moving back to restore a status quo that was known BC and has been burning or kindling ever since. Little moments here, but then moments of suppression. Then it comes back again with courtly love in the 14th century, and then real cult of chivalry. And it creeps in everywhere. It creeped into Christianity with the Mary cult. And now it's all over the place, right? It's in every conceivable aspect. But this was something that started many centuries ago and that women have been programmed to want again. And they're completely unconscious of it until it's stimulated, say, by a media on the outside. And that's exactly what happened. So feminism is nothing but this reactivation of gynocratic. And I use gynocratic because it's not quite to be linked with matriarchal. The woman who came out with that was Marija Gimbutas. And sadly, people like Joseph Campbell, slightly foolishly supported her thesis. But just like Margaret Mead's works was finally exposed as fraud, so is this Maria Gumbutus, and it's been women who've actually shown it to be false. So this means then that one has to not throw out matriarchy altogether as a phenomenon in the past, but try to revision it. And that's what my work does. I'm taking off from the fact that it's no longer scientifically credible to speak about matriarchy. The evidence just wasn't there, and more to think of cultish type gynocracies in which the older woman played a very big role. So this is where, you know, where you get, like in the Malleus Maleficarium, but not just in that, but the whole story or mythos of the hag, which you find not just in Shakespeare, but it goes back, you know, through your Hansel and Gretel's, and, you know, all the way back to ancient times, where the witch, the old witch, is always an old hag, you know, being demonized. That thread will actually lead you, interestingly, back to what we're talking about, a period in the past where women violated, you know, the rights of man in terms of patriarchy. I mean, and paternity. It still goes on today. You know, Montel Williams show, or whatever you've got, Geraldo, or some modern version of it. Where, I mean, do you realize that 1 in 10 women today admit that they don't know who the fathers were of their children? And that's just the ones who they actually get into being in a poll. And others have speculated that no, there's more that will lie. So the lying about paternity goes on today rampantly. And it's only the, you know, discovery of DNA and paternity tests that have turned the tide on women doing this. Well, what do we find out when we look back through some of the great scholars like Otto Rank and others, and that there was a period, probably late Neolithic, moving up to almost now we're talking about Europe here, so don't this has nothing to do with Jewish history or Middle Eastern history. This, I'm confining this to the European theater, in which almost up till about 4000 BC, women had lied frequently to men about paternity, and it changed the course of civilization. And just to cut a long story short, you know, this prioritization and this ethos gave them this entitlement that you're seeing being reawakened today. So when I talk gynocracy, I'm talking historically, that women have not just been changed since, you know, what, Jean-Jacques, Mary Wollstonecraft and John Stuart Mill, you know, in more recent times, Mary Shelley and all of this. No. Feminism and entitlement did not start, and this moving towards gynocracy did not start, you know, that recently. It was just reawakened again. And therefore, what this means is, in order to understand where women are going now, you've got to understand this history, because it's being repeated. And it involves some very extraordinary twists and turns. There's Gnosticism involved in this. There's dark occultism involved in this. You'd be amazed, you know, at menstrual blood imagery, you know, anything you can see in an Abramovich paintings and the so-called artwork, and a lot what you see on the media, can all be related and dated to this once you know what you're looking at.
Yeah, thanks for that. And that's about the Immaculate Conception, isn't it? It's about lying about male paternity and convincing the tribe, or mainly men, that the offspring were from the gods that came down through, I think you mentioned, in their dreams and stuff like that. That's and we might laugh at that now because you think that's impossible. You must know that you've had sex with someone, and then, you know, and I think you mentioned the point about must be able to look in the animal kingdom and work it out. But back then it was a completely different story, wasn't it? And they kept that lie going for quite a long time, and then it was only when men realized that lie had been perpetrated that the gender swung the other way societally, and men took more of a hold and created more of a surveillance society to stop the women from doing something like that, punishing them effectively, right?
That's right. Yes, they did. And the walled cities, which some have misinterpreted, that was what that was all about. They had to. Women had been given a chance to speak the truth, and they came up with all this concoction about the supernatural investment in the young. And this undid the reins of civilization, because civilization actually is son to father. As did become normalized later on, but it was already too late for civilization, is my thinking. We're already, the foundations of our civilization are already rotten. Now, Freud saw this, or saw elements of this, and he brought it out in a very short book called Totem and Taboo. Now, it's not accurate enough for me, but it is close to it. right? He had his own take on it anyway. And the parts that he kind of didn't get are more that the man, the young men of the tribe who go and kill the patriarch, he thought that they did it to get access to the mothers and the women for themselves. I prefer to think that they did it at the behest of the women of the tribe. So this is where, that book could be dissected far deeper than we're doing now, but I just feel that that was a mistake. That they didn't just come up with the idea on their own to say, let's get rid of this powerful patriarch. It's because they didn't know that the patriarch, one, was their father. He was just the leader and the king. They didn't realize they're blood related. Would have been a nice thing for Freud to have discovered. And also that from, I keep thinking of the Mordred McGann Fay, get rid of Arthur. Does Mordred really want rid of his uncle? Who poisoned the patriarch's image in Mordred's eyes? It goes back to your original question about this. The child cannot inherit the solar world if the mother has poisoned the view of masculinity and males in that 7-year or 700-year, if you really get into the mythological aspect. So in the semiotic, in the fetal, when you asked, can the masculinity of the child be affected in the womb? You bet it can, because that child is receiving the impressions of the woman. The mother has its own mother's basic schemata of the male world. And if she hates it, or if she's been brought up to hate it by her own terrible mother or by society, that child is going to grow up metrosexual, homosexual, man-hating, twisted. And the girl ain't going to fare much better. Long and short of it, look around. This is the world we've got right today, emanates from this. Because even when the child is older, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, it is perceiving father, right? If there's a father around, it's perceiving that figure, not as that figure really is, but as the figure that the mother has presented. We don't really need men, do we? One girl told me that her mother used to repeatedly say they'd been divorced, and she was one of 3 daughters, and all 3 daughters were repeatedly told, well, we don't need men anyway. If you went on to study, as I did, each of those girls' lives, how they turned out, it's not a pretty scene. And it all links back to this mother complex. Now, they didn't know that, right? They're young when they're being told this, and they have no idea that the 3 ways that they turned out, as they went through their teens and so on, until they're talking to me, they had no idea that each of their characteristics and temperaments was entirely based in a matrophobic, and the lies that the mother had told about the father anyway, that there had been conditioned, and you couldn't snap them out of it. They just didn't have what it took psychologically for them to even indulge in enough self-reflection maybe to, think about this. Because then inevitably the conversation will move into some Jungian stuff as well, about the inner masculine, inner female. I mean, we fucking lost that. You going to talk to an American about any of this?
They can't even name countries, let alone. Yeah. So we've never really had a father-son bond, then, have we? And even if we think we've had it, it's sort of tainted historically through this lens. So it's like got that negative historical lens through which people look at it, right? So has there ever been a time where there was a strong father-son bond that wasn't tainted or not?
Funny enough, I don't think there has been. Now, technically, it came on board later after this period, as we move, say, well, and remember, I didn't include the Jews in this. Anything in the Middle East has to be taken separately because there was no matriarchies there. There was a much more male-dominated, Persians, Egyptians. The women were very powerful in Egypt. So, but again, anything east of Prague needs to be taken in a separate way. I was just speaking there about matriarchy and its proof or disproof in terms of the European thing. Now, when these so-called Aryan invaders that the women always love to tell you about took over, well, obviously then there was a reinstigation where the men fucking, whoa, right? My son, right? This is shit. You see this at the beginning of the movie Conan the Barbarian, which is a very cleverly made film, actually, if you watch it carefully. Because the evil arcs in that film actually represent a female archetype, amazingly, not what people think. But at the beginning of that movie, you see William Smith, a great actor, and you see the young Conan, so to speak, having this dialogue about the secret of steel. So that is a moment in which, yes, they're encapsulating centuries there. And this also then went with the denigration of the woman and the sequestering of the woman and the surveillance of the woman. It also was the denigration of the hag. Older women were now made suspicious, were objects of suspicion. And funny enough, that's another thing that's being reprised in the coming Gynocracy. Older women right now are having a terrible influence on the younger women. It's all over the media. We keep a track of it on my Female Illuminati Facebook page. Mm. And over again, you're finding obscenities that our society doesn't even know how to put down to even immorality or amorality, let alone the things we're talking about that even go deeper. Like a mother lying through her teeth to her daughter, and then the daughter finds out that her so-called husband has been dating her mother. And even in terms, a grandmother. I mean, the headlines are just out of this world. Do you think this is National Enquirer? Where the younger girl's life has been completely ruined while the mother is secretly dating her husband. This kind of crap, right? So, I mean, it's right there. It's real amazing. So, but back in ancient times, yes, there did come this moment where, okay, especially in Scandinavian, father and son bond was reunited. But marvelous as that was, it was still compromised, and it still was too weak, and it came too late in history. We really have to fathom this. Wonderful as it was, and the great change that it was, it just came too late. And it didn't mean that still other pestilences were erased, you see. Civilization, I think, was still compromised. And then, don't forget, as I said, around about the 14th century comes back this fucking courtly love tradition where women are back again. Again, you'd have to go into the Jungian analysis of why that might have happened. But the fact is it did happen. And men start falling for the feminized, for the highly feminized female. And this is what is reprised in the Arthur story, where Guinevere, the queen of the kingdom, you see, is found profligate and goes off with, Lancelot, whatever, another knight, and slights the husband. And by doing that, the whole kingdom falls. You see, so you have other things we haven't talked about as well. But this paternity lie, which has been completely airbrushed by the feminists, and when you read their books, it's fascinating to see how they do this. And one of the ways of trying to do it was to come up with the lie of matriarchy. The whole lie that Maria Gimbutas and other scholars, Merlin Stone, all of these different, what was that lady's name who wrote The Chalice and the Blade? They'll come to me in a minute, and the Da Vinci Code movie was slightly based on her theories there. So those kinds of writers, they concocted matriarchy from archaeological remnants, you see, in order to actually exalt the role of the female in civilization, when in fact they were the destroyers of civilization because they had broken the son-father bond and the daughter-father bond when it comes to that.
And it's actually interesting because I think there's a connection here between the feminine and the masculine, in terms of the feminine tends to work more covertly, whereas the masculine works more overtly. It's more out in the open. Whereas the feminine, even if you look at female antisocial behavior, it's not overt, it's covert. It's sort of reputation destroying, gossip, innuendo, backstabbing. It's like subtly picking them apart from behind the shadows, behind the curtain. Correct. And I think when you use that, when you take that dynamic and you view it across, you extrapolate across history or society, you can see that actually that's almost what it sounds to me what's been happening. It was like slowly pulling the threads out, one by one, rather than this over, visible. It's more invisible, it's more hidden, it's more, I think this might even connect to maybe the female Illuminati when you've touched upon that before, but it's something it works behind the scenes, right? That's the feminine, that's the shadow feminine, right?
And that has been confirmed by one of the top card-carrying feminists called Phyllis Chesler. She wrote a book called Women's Inhumanity to Women, in which she catalogs exactly what you're talking about. And she's not the only one. So you're right. This surreptitiousness, because they got away with it as part of the atavistic thing. If you've got away with a crime for such a very, very long period of time, And then even when you were caught in the crime, you weren't really that penalized. And by the way, it was time to be penalized anyway, but you weren't really penalized. Then you got away with it. And therefore, this creates then, you know, a predisposition to continue lying. And women are no lovers of women. This is another fallacy that goes down with all of these marchers and protesters, right? The stats are out, and they've been out for a long time, that women despise working for other women. Over and over and over, you get to see this, that they don't want women promoted above their heads because they know that the place will be turned into a gulag. They much prefer to have male superiors. But see, although these facts are out, and there's so many more, and when it comes to even serial killers and their viciousness, it's been found that women are as equal, if not more extreme than men. It's been discovered that in domestic abuse cases, the women are now the equal, if not, some reports say, even more abusive to their children and to their males than we traditionally thought, you see, was the case. So although all these facts can be assembled and have been, I think you've interviewed Farrell.
Yeah, Warren Farrell. Yeah, he goes into it. Yeah, he's a scholar on that sort of stuff. Yeah.
Right, and he's not the only one. But although these facts have been collated, and many of them even by women writers, our society remains ultra-feminized. And that, you know, again, of course, is because of this maternal situation.
Yeah, we've become infantilized. That's the devouring mother. That's the terrible mother, isn't it? And I just wanted to ask you about that, because I think there's something really fascinating going on where gender dynamics, it's fractal. So what we see on the localized micro level, we also see on the macro level as well. So the dynamic that we might have in this regard to our terrible mother, we also see that with ourselves as an individual and the state and the government, and, you know, the kind of the nanny state, if you like. There you go. There's the feminine there, right? And I'm wondering if there's a correlation between, for instance, the last 2 years we had the lockdown, and what was the lockdown all about? We're going to keep you indoors to keep you safe. You know, we had the gaslighting. You're sick. You forget about your own perceptions. You're sick because I'm telling you you're sick. You know, you had all this going on. I even went, if you go to, I've got it here, you've got workplace mental health institutes. These are the 15 signs that you're in a abusive relationship. This is from the website. It says, stop you seeing friends and family, won't let you go out without permission, tell you what to wear, monitor your phones or emails, control your finances, control what you read and watch. I'm not going to go through all of them, but those are all the things that we were told in the last 2 years when we were on lockdown. So it's almost to me as though that dynamic extends outwards. And I don't know, Michael, if you've got an insight into this, but it's like Russian dolls. It's like, or a hologram. If you take a part of the hologram out, it affects the whole hologram. What's going on there? It seems as though there's a reality within a larger reality, and it just cascades outwards. Is that, how does this sort of fit together?
Well, any dynamic like that goes to the heart of what we've been talking about. See, masculinity in its fullest and most robust sense is love of nature and love of reality, somewhat like the way Ayn Rand presents it. Femininity, bizarrely, because you wouldn't think this if you've been stuck in your head into the New Age movement and the goddess tradition and all that palaver, femininity is the retraction from the laws of reality. And taken to its extreme, where we see it being taken to its extreme now, is actually misosophy, which is hatred of wisdom. So all feminism, any of this stuff that's going on, is that. It's a hatred of reality, pathological hatred of reality, starting, remember, with the erogenous zones and the armoring, but it branches out to the social level in these forms that we're seeing right now. Add to that urbanization, which is a form of armoring, believe it or not. See, once you start
there you go, yeah,
reading the right people, oh, wait a minute, you know, and beautifully, I think it was Erich Fromm in his Anatomy of Human Destructiveness, and Arno Gruen, these kinds of people clearly show you that the sterility of the modern age is as toxic as, say, you know, living in the sewers of the Middle Ages, right? They draw a parallel that it's the same thinking. It's the same sort of sterility and hatred of body, hatred of nature, hatred of growing things. Now, we know that it's women who keep their kids on a leash, who don't even let them run around in the parks, We used to play in sewers in Belfast. All right. And come in covered in mud and just all sorts of stuff, right? And the mothers didn't give a shit. I used to play around in the air raid shelters from the Second World War, right? I mean, just filthy tin cans and old bikes and mud, you know, and all of this.
That's long gone. That's long gone.
Yeah, we had a big factory, ICI factory, that spilt out its toxic chemicals, you know, into the local streams, in America they call creeks. We played in them where you could see the skin of the water. It was all discolored, you know, with oils and God knows what effluents they were letting. We played in all of that. We sniffed it. It didn't do us a bit of fucking harm, right? But today, don't even touch that handle. Oh my God, right? You know, and this fucking pathology posing as sane, posing as protection. So you see how this mind then has become incredibly armored and warped. And, you know, yeah, it's a big discovery as to why this is. But when you know what we've been talking about and you see the bigger picture, you can see that this urbanization is a protection against nature. We'll still have nature in it in the form of plastic plants or some decor or a mosaic or a little bit of a flowing fountain, and mostly in decor, right? But it's
not the real thing. But it's not the real thing.
No, it's simulated entirely. And you know something? Funny enough, the woman is more satisfied with that life than the man is. The man has been in more of a comatose situation because he's forgotten who he is. And he lives, you know, he lives in that feminized world. But it is the woman who is the most urbanized, and because she also benefits from it. I explain more of this on my site, ottowadinger.org. But the urban environment was customized for women, and the natural environment is for men. But slowly, as time has gone by, see, women have more customized. I mean, it's so meticulous, right? The customization for them of the world. So that means that the world is no longer really masculinized at all. You see this, I mean, it's a deep study. You have to study, you know, a lot of different things around you, but see it in a different way to find out that it's made for women's fingers, women's bodies, women's height, women's attention. You know, a lot of things go into this. It's a whole sociological study. And it's not for 5'9", 6'2" men. Just isn't. Right, and one needs to open their eyes on buses, on trains, and cars, and SUVs, and start observing, folks. Cash registers, standing in line. You'd be amazed at slowly, incrementally how the world has changed, you know, from what it was.
So, would you say that the male world is more nomadic? Is that his natural, or would you still say he settles, but it's more in nature?
Well, there's that big controversy about, you know, the agricultural to the nomadic. And if you look back to the most successful tribes who ever existed and lived, they were actually nomadic or partially nomadic, you see. And remember, isn't it more natural? You see, nature is going to always dictate at the end of the day what you do. And you can't survive in one particular climate. And given the amount of catastrophes and, you know, disasters that the world has known or any particular country has known, it makes more sense to be on the move, at least within a limited, you know, confines. And we find that this is the case. So, again, it's all based in temperament. But I feel very strongly that these anthropologist types were correct when they talk about this, what we've been talking about, that the settled, encircled city wasn't to protect against invaders. It was to watch the women. It was to try and put a kibosh on this problem, you know, as the whole zeitgeist changed, where he wanted to now discover the rules of, is he the father of these children? Because if it turned out that he was, I've tried in my work to describe what collapses all this mythos. Do you know what the women had built up in the lie? All this stuff about supernaturalism, all of this stuff about the dream, symbolism of the dream, a great many institutions that had been, you know, flourishing for thousands of years, and the most important one, female supremacy, and all that goes with that. That was all going to crash. All of it. Woman was no longer going to be seen as some divine special goddess that gods and ancient ancestors, you know, copulated with or mated with, and then in a mysterious and magical way give birth to the child. So this is not a small thing. Now we see that edification of women still when you study, you know, the designs of churches and ancient sites. It's all still there. You know, the Sheila and the Gig. It didn't all get erased. And so when you look back, you don't see evidence of matriarchy, but you can still see plenty of evidence of the adulation and exaltation of womankind. You know, the Vesica Pisces and all. It's still there. And in many ways, you know, probably should be there because there is a sacred aspect of all of this. But the woman took the sacred and abused it, and then was considered later on a witch for doing so. And then, but what they have done, don't forget, we've left out the most important part. When they were persecuted, that is actually a police action that they fucking well deserved. But what have later feminists done? They have started history where they want. They've put the gauge, the arrow, and said, there is proof of yet more male dominance over us, and left out the criminal aspect. When you put the criminal aspect back in, that's what I call the criminal history of womankind, the whole picture changes. And the prosecution, you know, now has some teeth. Because if you leave it out, then yes, it looks like Aryan hordes and wild invaders just happen to ride through the, you know, Europe, crushing all of these gorgeous matriarchs and imbecile writers like Leonard Shlain. There's a whole bevy of these feminized men who've written extensively about how wondrous those cultures were, in complete breach of the facts. But that lie tumbles, and the idea of matriarchy tumbles. The idea of any female supremacy tumbles. And the only supremacy left, the only entitlement a woman gets, is the women who then were subservient to their male and built culture, did not lie about paternity, and supported the male minds, bodies, and brains, you know, in a dynamic and real way, and assisted then in protecting children. In today's language, it would just simply be you're raising the children, you know, to be intelligent, moral, and masculine. I mean, you wouldn't believe, you know, how simple the formula is, and yet what kind of neurosis, deep pathology causes that to go askew. We're living in the consequences of it right now.
Would you say that this? So, I mean, at what point would you say that it became very gynocentric within? Let's just take Western society, because you said that the women were the ones that were being surveilled. They were kind of, you know, punished in a way for what happened in the past that we've forgotten about. But then there's almost like a bit of a change where they started to get control in a sort of covert way, and they managed to control society, where blaming men, blaming masculinity, airbrushing out the past that you mentioned as well. When did that start to happen? Because there seems to be a little bit of a switch in power there.
Yeah, I don't know. Different dates can be put on that. Second wave feminism, third wave phase, where they started to mangle Freud. They realized there's a lot can be done. As psychology started developing in a certain way, I don't know, writers, the feminist movement, agitated. See, when you have atavistic programming, it controls you. You don't control it. So it's not like it's an actual, you know, will, a conscious will that's moving. It's something ancient and dark that's moving you ever forward to regaining the power that you once had, because the smell of that power, the taste of it has carried through the millennia. And so this is where you get your cult of witches. And back then, the cult of hags, older women basically who perpetuated the lie, who took aside younger, goodly women and said, hey, do this. You know, you'll be exalted. You'll be made into a goddess. And we want to keep that going. And the men are suckers. Hey, they'll fall for this, right? This was a terrible criminal act. But it gained them centuries and centuries of power. And so atavism is nothing more than that. It's the seeking again for the power of the old. And so once you have, and that's here, that's in the back of all women's minds. And so the masculine woman is the one who discovers that, acknowledges it, and cancels it. That's the true definition of the masculine woman, is the one who understands that voice is in her head, observes her behavior, that she can fall into that trap, and he says, no, I admire men, right? And I'm not going to abuse my sexuality and my beauty. That's it. That's the formula right there. Anyone who doesn't do either of those things is on the feminist side, is still got a long way to go. And what they've got to realize is that back then, that lie, right, of paternity brought them destruction, so to speak, or brought them, to lose their positions in society. So it is today. You're not going to win today. The gynocracy is doomed. Within the atavistic memory is another memory. The memory of it didn't work, it failed. Yeah, you better think about that now, because it's going to fail again. Nature will not, doesn't like a vacuum, and nature doesn't want a lie to be perpetuated endlessly. So the whole program, whether it was in ancient times, prehistoric times, or it's in the most modern times as we go, it's doomed to failure one way or the other. And what we're doing is part of that, is the awakening that man should understand who he is, where he came from, what the dynamic has been historically between man and woman, so that a cult of courtly love. Because as you said, why would things change again after, when man knew this? It was because we went to sleep. The guardians fell asleep. When we thought we had women under control, we stopped looking at them as criminals, and very gradually they were able again to reestablish their mystique. The very first article in Dragon Mother, or I think it's adultism, is on
adultism. Yeah. No, I was actually going to. That was the thing I was going to mention. It's that female mystique, and there's different levels to that, because you see that in the young girls who are quite nebulous, and they don't really understand that atavistic, that conditioning, that ancestral conditioning they've got, but they just know it's powerful, and they kind of walk around with that, embodying that kind of that nebulous feminine feeling, right? And that's actually what attracts, I would say, the first stage boys. In my work, I call that the immature feminine attracts the immature masculine in that way, right? But then I think there's another level to that. I think I was reading in Esther Harding's work, she was talking about the next stage from that is when they actually bring a consciousness into that feminine energy. And that's when they start to utilize it, and they weaponize that. And that's when you get the gold diggers and all that kind of stuff, where they're actually using that female mystique for their own ends, right? And then I think there's another level to that where it's more integrated, where they actually have more of a supra-personal ambition to serve society, serve a god, serve a religion, have some kind of communitarian aspect to their feminine. And I think that's more of the kind of the maturing aspect of that. But what we're saying here is that female mystique is actually unknown to a lot of women. It's unconscious to a lot of women, but yet they use that because they know the effect that it has on other men. And actually that's that mystique that has actually, I don't know, swayed men, isn't it? Because men follow women. So where there's that mystique, you're going to have the men that are just the tongue dropping to the floor, doing whatever they want, creating those chivalric men, or as I call them, the pseudo alpha male, the Baywatch, Jersey Shore jocks.
Yes,
that's how that mystique is a powerful spell, isn't it?
Yeah, you see, that's right. And the mystique is rooted again in the lack of the awakening of the erogenous zones. When you are malignant, or when you're armored, which is another word of saying emotional plague, it's you're disconnected from the pleasure centers of your body. Don't you see how female mystique then becomes all the more powerful to you later on?
Explain that one, Michael. How?
Well, you're more attracted to the female mystique because you're cut off from your own erogenous zones. And the woman is then endowed with a greater deal, is endowed with greater significance, because you're looking to her to be this perfect lover, this perfect, so, and then with all of the advertising embellishment that women have done in the cosmetics industry, that's what they play upon. They play upon the fact that you are repressed sexually, and that you'll have an abnormal fascination with their bodies. The person who is erogenous zones are stimulated isn't as gullible and malleable. You'll deal with women, in a much more holistic way. But your pole dancers, your porn stars, all of our culture has become sexualized because of this breakdown in what we're talking about and the rise of emotional plague. So the woman is therefore stirring the pot. She, on some level, her mothers, her peers, all fall into this cult of mystique, which is to manipulate men. And the man is open to being manipulated because, as I said before, he's armored. And he's armored because of the mother's touch. You see, so how you can't get out of this wheel, right? The mother makes you susceptible, makes you impoverished in your libido, that then inevitably makes you victimized by the beautiful women, and the beautiful women are by and large abusing that beauty and sexuality, not as it once was to lead you to truth, which is the higher archetype of the feminine, right? No, it's to lead you to perdition and to entrapment, you see. And then on some other subconscious level, in reaction to this, you get your sort of homosexuality. That's not its only root, but one phase of homosexuality is this awareness that women are toxic. And so the man seeks refuge then in a perverse way with other men, because they had a dragon fight as well. Although I focus more on the daughter-mother relationship, you can be sure that it also happens with the male child, and their mothers. And if that turns warped, you will want to seek comfort and care and sexual fulfillment with males. You just won't want to have anything to do with women, because on some level that it's completely Stygian and abusive.
Yeah, and also the kind of the transgender agenda as well. That's got to be part of that.
It is. Yeah, it's all explained in the book how that works. That's why we went into such great detail.
Yeah,
and again, just to make the point that feminism should threaten no one, because like anything that you do with science, you go into their own arguments, and if you have the philosophical study and awareness, and of course more importantly psychological in this case, you'll be able to undo each point that they have, which are the pillars of their platform, right? You will be able to see how absolutely ludicrous it is. So there's a study to be gone through, always remembering that in this case the philosophy is secondary to the psychology. This is pathology that you're dealing with. The woman's behavior by and large today is pathological, and that's what takes you into the history, but it also can take you into individual cases. And there's great works out there that I mentioned in the bibliography of the book and on the website that people can really get into to reinforce. They shouldn't just be believing me, they should be fundamentally observing the world of women, what they do every day, what they talk about, where they're at in their minds and hearts, see the inherent contradictions, like I told you, the glaring one of the 80s into later periods. And then you see these obese women screaming about why men don't treat them as goddesses or whatever and won't date them. And how I was like, you ever heard of Mother Nature, lady? It's like, I'm sorry, but Mother Nature ordained it that for the man to breed his offspring, he wants a certain kind of woman. So, but the urbanized woman that I'm just telling you about has no clue what they're talking about. So they're sitting there on the media talking absolute nonsense. And nobody is contradicting them, saying, but it's a matter of nature that women needed to look slim or well-built or good-looking. So it's all nature. Nature's deciding on that for a man to, do his job and create offspring. Where were you? Where did you get your education? Well, see, this is it. But the thing is, like I said, when you go into each of their own faux pas, who's actually doing that? The danger is we're going to, when that woman was talking, she's hoping that a lot of, betas are listening to her and go, oh my God, that's right. And then I'm going to start dating these overweight women or something, and change the status quo. But it's all completely irrational, because we're not being educated by anyone to push back at this nonsense. I mean, and yet it's actually on one level very, very simple. Nature has ordained what man sees in a woman that he wants to reproduce with. So where are you coming from, lady? No, ridiculous.
And just to finish up as well, there's one other thing that I wanted to ask, is that a daughter has a dragon fight with her mother. She has that matrophobia. Why does she not then identify more with the male? Why is it then she siphons off her blame for the mother onto the male at that point? Or are there some that actually take refuge in the male world? But why is there some kind of schism there? There's some kind of break where she then jettons that off towards men. She sort of blames men at that point.
Well, you see, there are women who, because of this dragon mother fight, do definitely identify with men. But because they feel so sullied, because remember, the syndrome is that if my mother didn't like me or treated me badly, maybe I've done something myself. I am a bad person. That kind of woman goes over to the male side, but then hangs out with a bunch of drug dealers and thugs and rappers, and a kind of man who himself is destructive within the male world. thinking that by identifying with that thug or that biker, right, or that rapper, that you're with the hardcore male. But you're not. You're with a broken male who himself has got some major syndromes. You know, so she will live vicariously through that kind of malignant male figure who calls women bitches, who gambles and drinks and pushes women around. And then she becomes a slut, right? She starts identifying with, because it's all broken down.
Because why does she go for that man first, though? Why is it that those men are the most available to her at that moment, not the masculinized men?
Well, when she seeks them out, she feels that she can't be with a normal man because she has been broken in her own will. And she's identifying with the darker shadow male in an idea subconsciously that she's doing real shadow work, so to speak. You know, it's a very, very, say, for instance, look at it the other way. If a boy is growing up from infancy and the mother keeps on denigrating his body type, right, or his genitals. Oh, no woman's going to ever want you. Ugh. You know, like a Jeffrey Dahmer type, right? That kid is going to grow up with a very, very bad relationship to women and probably just give up because his mother has programmed him to believe that no woman is going to want to be with a scrawny little thing like you. And look at look at your handsome cousin. Look at your handsome, you know, somebody or other. The woman can feel the same way. She can be so denigrated in her femininity by an evil, you know, terrible mother who's so broken her will that she feels so utterly unattractive. You see, that she'll go with men that she secretly doesn't really care for. So she seeks out men that are criminals.
The low-hanging fruit, basically.
Yeah, and what about these women who line up at a serial killer, you know, at the prisons wanting to have a baby with it, with, you know, the Night Stalker? Well, the same thing, because you really don't care about him. He's already been jailed. He's already a bad boy. It's had some nice optics for you to, you know, get some media coverage yourself. And the newspaper wants to know, National Enquirer will give you £1 million for your story and all these superficial things. But the real reason why they go with those bikers and those thugs is because they don't care about them. They're just throwaway males. They're the ersatz males, you know, that will you don't need to love them. You don't need to go deep. You don't have to have intimacy. So there's a lot of reasons why women will do this. But basically what happens is the whole thing breaks down because the daughter, although harangued by a terrible mother, eventually by 6 years old identifies with her power. Not with her. Obviously not with her. Well, you know, sometimes it's with her. But mostly it's this crazy psychological dynamic of the awesome power that has controlled you, has trained you. It's almost like a form of entrainment. And you know, I call it the scimitar, the Medusa's great castrating, you know, sword that Freud got wrong, but Rank got right. It's not the father that the child has feared. He'll castrate me because he'll sense that I want to have an erotic relationship with my mother. No, you got to move it. It's not right. Otto Rank corrected it. He did the chiropractor and he put this thing into place. It's the terrible power of the mother that you identify with. Her weapon. She is the one who is really the castrator. And I explain this, walk everybody through this on the site and in the books. And because of that, you become a terrible mother in her stead. All tyranny creates tyranny. That's why it's so deadly. And that's why, you know, the woman might enter into the masculine world, right? The solar world, but she does it as a doomsday weapon. And that's what we see all around us, is gangs of women, these lunatic, radical left women, and so many of their supporters quietly, go girl, you know, I'm not going to sign on for it, obviously, but I'm really behind you 100%. And sometimes you get these little Freudian slips where you can tell, wait a minute, what? So much seething male hate in so many women. Well, all of those types devolve back to this kind of pathology in which they often become terrible mothers. Now, it doesn't mean 100% terrible mother. You can have 20% terrible mother. Still going to do a lot of damage. And now we get this cult of single mothers where the man is not even required. The entitlement's out the door. And therefore our governments are now in sync, mental sync with the feminine. They're actually feminine institutions. It's not Big Brother anymore. It's Big Mother. That's why I said the common gynocracy. More and more and more, the male world is wrapping its own self around the female will. up until the political level. It means more women in positions of control everywhere you look, both corporate and governmental, and even in other areas, and more pathology coming out of that. And you can break that down. See, we haven't even explored here, other levels of pathology like hysterics and obsessives and schizoids. This thing breaks down into other neurotic traits as well, because the compensation when you've been raised by a terrible mother, but you've not been able to really attack her, right? She just has her way. You grow up, you become a rebellious teenager or whatever it might be, right? In all of this is a strange personal shame or guilt about not really being able to turn around to the object of your hate and do anything about it. In fact, you've actually really identified with her. So what this means is that the woman has become exonerated. The terrible mother is always exonerated. And if you do that too much, you create a society in which there's a blind spot, in which no female crime is ever acknowledged for what it is. We're there now. Women are all around, even in the courts, getting the lightest sentences that anyone can ever imagine. This is documented. And it's almost like there's this myopia with society that it doesn't matter. If it's a woman, then she's got reasons, or, we have no way to penalize her, and of course this is just snowball and make things a lot worse. And then maybe the last thing to say on that question is, don't forget the Jungian aspect. As I wrote in the last article, Dark Mother Divine, this thing has an intrapsychic component as well, because in all this matrophobia, all these violations of true healthy masculinity and femininity creates an incredible dynamic within, in terms of one's own relationship with their inner masculine and inner feminine. And that is also is one of the reasons why women are doing what they're doing. They're being guided by their own dark anima, the dark female within, which is a response to the dragon fight, is now in control of their minds, and on a social level and even on the individual level. So it's got quite dark, as you would imagine from looking at all this history, that one day it might. Well, and of course the media plays an enormous role in this, because with these kinds of idiotic female Xena, and just all the rest of it, these Tomb Raiders and all these ridiculous images of women playing masculine roles and all the other crap, they have completely dismantled the healthy archetype. And this will then have psychological consequences. We've explored that extensively here in Enslaved, the Women in the Unconscious series. I can put the links below for that. So, yeah, I see the coming Gynocracy as being rooted in the past, as exercising a great deep desire within all women to maintain, call it a matriarchy, call it a Gynocracy, women power and control. You're English, so do you ever, maybe you don't remember the comedy team, the two Ronnies back in the 70s and 80s?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Yeah, Ronnie Barker, Ronnie Corbett. They actually ran several films, believe it or not. And one of them was called The Worm That Turned. If I can find clips of that, I'll put it below. The Worm That Turned. And it's about the coming Gynocracy, in which women create a fascist state in modern times, go around in basically fascist uniforms, and have made it so that all the men must have women's names and dress in women's garbs. Now, this was done under the guise of comedy, right? The Worm That Turned. And it's an attempt of the men to form a little secret society or get together, to overthrow the status quo. But if you scrape off the comedy on the top of it, it's unbelievably prophetic. So this is where we're going. Of course, that was exaggerated, right? We're not going to be having women's names and women's costumes, but psychologically speaking, it'll be the next best thing, where our thinking. I think women will always need a 5 or 10% hardcore male to build the bridges and create the infrastructure, right? But the rest of mankind, as I can see, or we can see, is going the other way, and will be in just circulation around the female will, or will literally be government. Women are soon going to learn how to procreate without the need of men at all, and you don't know what these post-humanists have got in store. And one way or another, at least we have this thread to follow, where it'll be the female will, slowly and incrementally, because they don't want to attract attention to what they're doing. And a lot of them don't even know it. That's where the atavistic thing is coming in. But the seething hatred of being found out as criminals in the past has not gone away. So that's what that word atavistic contains. And then, as you hinted, there may be even female cults out there right now, very, very dark cults, who also share this agenda and are financing the very thing that we're talking about. That's also another thing, you know, that I go into. But yeah, we've dealt with the psychology of it. It's priority. And yet the strange thing of all is that the solutions to all of this are actually amazingly straightforward and simple. As we said, women, you better start admiring men and don't abuse your sexuality and your beauty. How difficult is that, you know?
Absolutely, yeah. We actually covered a lot of ground there. I mean, maybe I actually wanted to go into, but we'll have to keep this for another time. I wanted to go into how this plays out in neurology as well, neuroscience, because Ian McGilchrist, I had a chat with him about this, and he refers to it as the master and his emissary. In other words, the hemispheres of the brain. That was something I was going to ask you, but I think I'd like to hold that back for maybe another time.
Well,
but
I will
there's
say
definitely
one word
there's
about that.
definitely a it's expressed through neurology in terms of the hemispheres of the brain is what I was going to go into.
Well,
Yeah.
the one thing that we must say about that, and it connects to what we said about armoring and repressed sexuality, is that it is the right hemisphere of the brain, according to Arthur Yanov, in which all the feelings of hurt, rage, and resentment in the dynamic of with something like the terrible mother is stored. But the next step to that is that the right brain controls the the nervous system. So you can't just say, oh, it's all stored, in the right brain, the rage, that's bad enough. But it also turns out to be something that then when you follow these Yanovs through and Reiches through, it actually is contained within the very cells and meridians of the body, this rage, and then contributes to the armoring. So when you expand upon what armoring is, it really goes pretty deep. It really does go into something that, and then I've added a couple of points very quickly, and that is that armoring is not just a armoring against worldly stimuli, right, which might overflood you. Because remember, the feminized person cannot deal with the reality principle. Another definition of masculinity is one who can, because the mother has wet nursed you and programmed you to be able to deal with reality. So the feminized person is going to be more armored because they're trying to resist the influx of the reality principle. But armoring, actually, when you go into it even deeper, is also preventing core emotions from flooding to the surface. Why would it do that? Because those are the very emotions of rage and hurt and whatever. And they do come to the surface, but the armoring holds them back. So when a girl who's bulimic, anorexic, say has bad eyesight, rashes, a lot of different other syndromes that when you know what you're looking at, you can see it. That is because she's having problems, with this energy flooding forth. In order to push it back, you've got to continually not only identify with the object of your hate, but you've got to put this marzipan coating on. Women are just gray and men are just horrible. So, right? And if men are horrible, I'll even date horrible men. Aren't I brilliant for proving? Look at this brute that I date. He's a womanizer. He's an alcoholic. He's a thief. Right? So the woman needs to prove to herself, to keep this emotion back. A lot of physical, social things go on. It's actually remarkable. And as I said, it would take another whole podcast to delineate, because there's actually 3 to 4 different ways that women, completely different, will deal with the same phenomena, but in 3 or 4 different ways. They're fascinating to study. So when you're dealing with neuroscience, it's the right brain that contains all the rage. And so when Arthur Yanov used to manipulate the body in the same way that, say, Reich or Alexander Lowen would do, that's what comes up in the primal scream. The primal scream and the emotions get released when people, come back to health, which is bioenergetic therapy. And we'll have a coming podcast in early March on this again. So when these emotions are released, say from this chakra or wherever, right, this is what is happening. So obviously, if you're not going to go through those therapeutic systems, then it's more likely that the women who are, or even men who have embodied this rage, are going to become more and more armored. Well, fat is a kind of armoring. Charles Konia, the Reichians now know that it's a pillowing. not just against the world outside, which is a threat, because it's called the reality principle, but these deep emotions from within that represent the matrophobic, the dragon fight, the deep rage of having your will crushed and your identity destroyed, and all of this stuff is burning within. So the fat, which has now become epidemic amongst women, is a kind of armoring against their own matrophobia. So you don't need to attack them from outside, right? Their own physiognomy, their own psychology is the proof of everything we're saying. One just needs to observe it.
They also go into the mind as a recluse as well. That's another way that they escape the feeling of the body. So they can go into the left brain. They start to overanalyze. They mechanize. They see the world as a detailed break, like a puzzle that's been broken into 100 pieces. That's the way they see it, because they're not in that holistic right brain feeling, somatic way of seeing, perceiving the world as well. And actually, I just wanted to read you this, Michael. This is from Ian McGilchrist. This just blew my socks off when I read this. It says, a society that's left brain dominated, it would lead to an emphasis on uniformity and equality, not as just one desirable to be balanced with others, but as the ultimate desirable transcending all others. As a result, individualities would be ironed out and identification would be seen by categories, socioeconomic groups, races, sexes, and so on, which would also feel themselves to be implicitly in competition with, resentful of one another. Such a government would seek total control, panoptical control, would become an end in itself, and constant CCTV monitoring, interception of private information and communication the norm. What are we seeing? So it's all there, isn't it?
See, what's happened, we didn't go into the four, neurotic categories, but they, just like what he's addressing there, is when you don't feel, because you can't afford to feel, or because of bioenergetic armoring, what happens then is a compensatory concern with the rights of others and the woes of others and the status of others, right? This is political correctness and tolerance. This is the compensation of the ego, the left brain, as exactly as he's saying, to pretend that you're a caring person, when all the real care structures in your being on a truly bioenergetic level have been completely cut off, because you can't let yourself feel what you feel against the parent, right? So you shut it down, you armor. But then we can't operate in society as this cold, Apollonian stick insect. Although you get that too. Look at that creature that was the Prime Minister of New Zealand, for instance, right? I mean, it's so amazing when you look at this Nancy Pelosi, right? So, but obviously it inhibits you to work in society if you're a bit like that, because you find out that people don't like you, right? So the collectivity comes in because they're saying, are you like me? Are you like me? Yeah, we're all the same. And then this loss of identity into the crowd. And the crowd, in a classic, see, Gustave Le Bon always talked about the crowd being feminine. So there's your connective tissue. The crowd is an obscenity. It is an anti-natural. But it is by definition feminine in that a certain idea moves it. You join it to lose identity, and you do so violently. And in that state, it's like they've all agreed to mobilize themselves based in some pseudo concern, because actually they're schizoid and hysteric and have no true feelings towards anything, including themselves. But I can put on a pink hat, I can wave a placard, and this is another one of the phenomena. I'm glad you did bring that up, because this takes on. This whole thing that we're talking about takes on an enormous amount of sociological phenomena, political, complexions. And I try to deal with those in the articles. But what we're dealing now, we're drowning in this counterfeit emotionality. It's very easy for people to fall into it. And the more armored you are, the more you fall into it. And then you can point to the other side, who appears to be more stoic and more rational, and go, well, I care about people, but hold on, I'm not going to support a bunch of malingering single mothers. Oh, you bloody fascists. See, so this creates a polarity then, where one side can now blame the other. And that's what's actually been happening. And a lot of it is guided by even archetypes as well. The interesting, facet there to explore. It really goes on. But I love McGilchrist. I'm so glad that you got a chance to talk to him, because I plan to do something on his book. And we've just never got round to doing it. There's so many fascinating things in that book, actually, that need to be brought to light, and we've just never here on Enslaved quite yet. got to that part, you know, but I hope to do that in the future. But yeah, I definitely want to watch that interview.
Yeah, and there's just so many crossovers, so many overlaps, and I think once you open one door, it just opens so many more, and then you start to see how it all percolates, how it all connects together, and it's just, you know, it starts to really crystallize in front of you, and it's just, you know, it's incredible, really. So
well, women have tried to airbrush the themes that we're talking about. They know that these exist. They know what authors, even Freud, had some of this stuff. So they have for over 100 years attempted to, you know, stage manage their narrative so that you'll never come across. But I've made a thorough study of feminism, women's studies, you know, and all of this and many other things, and have come across that which they tried to either hide or tweaked in some way that you wouldn't see the actual facts, you know. But everything I'm saying, it can be observed in society, despite all the different mental, you know, sort of coping, you know, the neurotic boundaries that stop people seeing this truth. But see, the one good thing that's happening right now is at least a lot of what we're talking about is visible. Remember, if we were talking about this in another time, it might not have been so easy. Woman is now acting in such a gratuitous way, and the media is so gratuitous that this actually, I always think of this as one of the best times. Like I said, people can go to my Female Illuminati thread on Facebook and just see the headlines over and over and over. Again, the atrocities that are being done and the open criminality as it's all coming to the surface. So I actually think there is a benefit of getting into the subject now more than any other time.
Absolutely, yeah. Just one final thing, because I know we've been going on a while. Do you see that this is connecting to, let's say, abortion? How a lot of these feminist sort of Medusan type women, the ones that are really, you know, terrible mothers, let's say, they seem almost passionate about killing the unborn. You know, it's almost, to them, it's like some kind of, you know, a win for female empowerment, that to actually to destroy life within themselves. To them, it's just, they get more angry than the pro-lifers. And I just think there's some kind of weird psychology there going on. Is that kind of connected or not?
Yeah, it must be, because the womb, gyna, even the word gynocracy, gyna, comes from the word for woman. And you have like the Gwen, the woman's name, or Gwyn, like Guinevere, right? Or gin, the alcohol. Gyna, Genesis, right? All comes from the word meaning the gyna. And that is the womb, bearer of the womb. And so do you remember that in the past, they used to call neurotic women hysterics, right? And all of this, that again is a reference to the womb. So in some strange way, and remember, the dominion that woman has over the fetus is, in many ways, mythologically speaking, centuries. And it's where the greatest power that they will ever exercise is. Otherwise, they wouldn't be getting pregnant so early anymore. You know, they're doing it earlier and earlier and earlier. So there is some dynamic there, yeah, in which this archetypal, the dark anima, Medea, you know, the murderess of children, the devourer of the child, you know, this sort of tyrannical, terrible mother starts as early as in the womb. So then, yeah, the killing of a child in the womb, of course, it makes perfect sense, right? Because even if the child is allowed to live and carries on through the Oedipal years, what's being done is the crushing of that child's identity. I mean, that's just a fact. You know, it is a kind of a devouring in which you're trying to either crush the identity of that child or make them into an image of yourself in ways that we've, you know, laid out a few points as to why this might happen. But the real animosity, though, the real criminality, is the psychological predisposition to despise masculinity and misosophy, the hatred of reality, the hatred of truth. These are the kinds of people that you're dealing with. So a lot of things can be made, you know, postmodernism, which is profoundly negative, profoundly caustic, profoundly undermining of all previous structures. Where in hell would that come from? It's very connected to feminism. It's all coming out of a basic hatred of reality. And you can't go after it to critique it unless you knew that. If you stupidly went to, well, I'm just going to go after their own, you know, I'm going to take them on, without understanding the root of where this thing came from. The critical theory or postmodernism is just pure hate. Then
it's anti-life.
And then hatred of what? Hatred of reality, hatred of masculinity. See, it'll open up doors that questions that nobody's ever asked before. Why would I want to hate reality? That's a foreign concept to me. But the person who questions it might start to study. Yeah, that's really true. And see other things around us. Hatred of the body, as the Wilhelm Reichs. Hatred of self, audiophobia. Wait a minute. Hatred of masculinity? I can really hate that? I didn't even know such a concept existed. So our society then needs to branch out in that way and start to learn about these things that maybe you could live a whole life and never even think about. You know, like women actually hating femininity, hating themselves. And that's why they have to create an ersatz version, an obscene version, to replace that which is really real. Like the overweight woman talking about why she's not attractive to men. I mean, and then blaming men for that. It's like, what kind of a fucking thinking is that? Nature has decided that, lady. How unnatural you must be to not even know that. You see, so it all falls back on themselves. Yeah. But remember, they're the owner of the womb. And the womb, the womb was their call to goddesshood, because it was the sanctum in which the ancestors and the gods came and put a fetus, put a child, not man. Yeah. They'd even say a sacred animal did it. They'd say a beam of light did it. You know, an angel of the Lord or whatever, you know, it might have been. So the whole, there's a lot to, you know, and that's why you see in advertising the letter Q or the O. Women will, you'll see this gigantic O or symbolism of the O in so much advertising. And X, by the way, the X chromosome, there's a lot of womb symbolism in advertising, and it's all directed towards women to awaken some of this evil atavistic stuff. You know, and it's running rampant. So the person who doesn't acknowledge the psychological aspect of this has no hope in hell. He won't have what it takes to defend civilization.
Yeah, and I think that would be, we're only really scratching the surface. That's the funny thing about it. I mean, you know, there's so much. It's endless, really. But I think this is the path that everyone should go down to understand reality, understand relationships. You know, this is the crux of it all. So to not do this work is almost to walk through the world, you know, with a blindfold on.
Definitely. It's terrible to see, because man is reacting all right. He's still reacting to any of this, but in ways that are just purely infantile. He's got to go back to the founders of psychology. He's got to, you know, go to the Arthur Yanovs and these kinds of people and start to realize, you know, what the hell is really going on. And a lot of that will take you into history, but it'll take you into controversial history, because it said things like matriarchy have already been debunked, you know, and then another thing is put there. And basically where I've gone is just studying women's psychology. This all just started by a genuine interest in female psychology, then not finding out the lie that they were talking about, why these Aryan riders, you know, the solar cult would rise up against them in Europe. Just the story of that forensically and criminally doesn't make sense. There's no way it makes sense. But when you put the pieces back, you know, that might have been a retaliatory action against them for a certain crime. Well, then the next question is, what crime? And you have to go and search for that. And it's quite elusive because they've covered it up. The last thing they want you to know is about this lie of paternity and how it changed the whole face of civilization. But once you find out about it, okay, but then it doesn't become just a historical anecdote, something about some ancient peoples. Okay, wow, what a discovery, great, frame it. No. The dynamics of the period, that for centuries they had this superiority, this female supremacy, stayed here, stayed within their atavistic racial memory. And through the centuries, there's been this underlying desire to regain this gynocratic power. And never more than in our times, you know, partly with the rise of feminism, but also partly the whole misunderstanding of what real, genuine masculinity is. They're getting their way. And, you know, they're more than halfway to literally, as I say, in the two Ronnies, comedic as it may be, you know, there's something very, very, very frightening underneath of that. And we're heading right for it. It's like a doomsday situation.
No, we really are. We really are, yeah. You can see it with the soy boys and the hipsters and everything, you know.
That's right.
That wasn't there like 20 years ago. It's definitely got worse now. So you can see this is at warp speed now. Michael, thank you for that. That was enlightening, as always. We covered so much ground there.